I'm Jim Collison and live from the Gallup studios here in Omaha, Nebraska, as well as the Gallup offices in Sydney, Australia. This is Gallup's Called to Coach, recorded on March 13th, 2018. Called to Coach is a resource for those who want to help others discover and use their strengths. We have Gallup experts and independent strengths coaches share tactics, insights, and strategies to help coaches maximize the talent of individuals, teams, and organizations around the world. If you have questions just during this live webcast and you're watching us live, we'd love to have you log into our chat room right below the main video window, just down below there. Choose the login button, bottom left-hand corner. Choose the guest account. You don't need to create one. Just choose guest, take the name and the number out, put your name in so I know who you are, and we'll be taking your questions live during this program. If you're listening to the recorded version or have questions about custom strengths coaching solutions for small, medium, or large organizations, we do that as well. You can send us an email, contact us coaching@gallup.com, or send us some info in the contact form right there on the live page. Don't forget to visit the Gallup Strengths Center, just gallupstrengthscenter.com. For all your CliftonStrengths coaching resources and training needs, you can also catch the video in both streaming and downloadable audio. We call that podcasting, available for you on your device, on your mobile device, Android, iPhone, any of those devices available for you. You can get all the information on how to do that on all the webcasts that we do here at Gallup. It's available at our coaches blog. It's easy to find, coaching.gallup.com. Ann Lingenfelter is our host today and works as a learning solutions consultant with Gallup out of our Sydney, Australia office. And I got a peek outside the windows today. A little foggy, but I'd still love to be with you. And Sydney, welcome back to another Call to Coach.
Thanks, Jim. It's always great to be here. We will get you here eventually, I am sure. And yeah, it is kind of a gray day here in Sydney. We don't get a lot of those, but it is today. The last time I was in Omaha, there were icebergs floating down the river. So
it was cold. It was cold while you were here. Sorry. We'll have warmer weather the next time you come back for the summit.
Yeah, absolutely. That's fantastic. So, Jim, my guest today, I think, will be of a lot of interest, especially to the folks who are looking at or working in the healthcare space. There's been an awful lot of information out there of late talking about the sorts of issues that hospitals and medical centers and those working in healthcare are facing. And I think that our guest today is going to shed a little bit of light on what can be done within an organization to start to address things like patient outcomes via higher engagement scores for employees. So Penny Gray is my guest. She's a registered organizational psychologist and holds the position of group learning and development consultant at St. Vincent's Hospital here in Australia. It's a large national health and aged care provider. In her current role, Penny supports leaders and their teams to incorporate strengths-based approaches for improved engagement and performance across all levels of the organization. As an internal strengths coach, Penny promotes a coaching culture to create a positive, safe work environment. Penny's top 5 are learner, individualization, arranger, maximizer, and belief. Penny, welcome to Called to Coach.
Thank you, Anne. It's a pleasure to be here.
I'm sure that you've seen a few of these, but it's always fun to do your first Call to Coach and get to meet and talk to Jim. And I think it can be, for guests who watch these shows, I think it can be extraordinarily beneficial for them just to kind of, as you and I were talking before, for them, it's sort of like you bringing them into a day at work. And kind of exposing them to the way that strengths and engagement concepts can be brought to life within various organizations. So thank you in advance for your willingness to be here today to talk about the work that you're doing. If you don't mind, I talked a little bit about you being an organizational psychologist and such, but you have done work outside of the healthcare industry as well. Can you tell the audience a little bit about what you've done prior to your time at St. Vincent's?
Okay, so in my working life, I've worked internally within organisations, such as in this role, and I've also worked as an external consultant. So I've done a bit of both, and I'm also part-time in this role. I work 3 days a week at St. Vincent's, and outside of that, I continue to do a little bit of my own coaching and consulting as well. So yeah, it is good to have had both perspectives of working as an internal consultant. I've also worked in universities, so I've also had the position of lecturer and placement supervisor. And I also continue to supervise provisional psychologists, so psychologists at varying levels of their development and those who are seeking registration as psychologists.
Okay, fantastic. So As someone who's working in the healthcare industry, if you were to sort of step back and give us a big overview of the sorts of issues that healthcare is facing, and some of these, of course, will not be unique to healthcare, but if you were to say the big issues that are sort of out there that everyone is talking about, what would those be?
Well, in the work that I've been doing, I think what's most important, and as you say, there are issues that are common to all workplaces that people are dealing with, and that's around dealing with change, constant change in workplaces, and that is a common one. I think it's really about the focus on providing support to patients in terms of their health outcomes, and it means that what I'm looking to do is also supporting the employees who are providing those support services to patients, and that's really the focus of the work that I'm doing. There's also a lot of emphasis on physical health and safety, and I think really, again, the engagement and strengths work provides a great platform for having conversations and exploring issues around self-care and employee well-being, and which is so important. So.
Yeah, 100%. So certainly we've done a Gallup, and we're not alone in this, but has done a lot of research looking at patient outcomes and how those are improved by having higher levels of engagement with your internal customers, right? Meaning the employees. So being able to talk about how you've focused on that at St. Vincent's would be really useful. Can you talk a little bit about how you came to know Gallup first and what your first encounters were with us?
Mm-hmm. So St. Vincent's did the Q12 engagement survey in 2016 and then again in 2017. So last year I was looking to see how I could support leaders and support the organisation to interpret, make sense of their survey results. So I had worked previously, I have worked with strengths generally, and I've brought that to the work that I've been doing. I've been there for nearly 4 years, and I've certainly looked at implementing strengths-based approaches into my work, which is essentially around leadership and management development. And last year I was interested to gain accreditation with another assessment instrument in, a strengths assessment. So I looked at Strengths Finder, and then it became apparent that there are those strong links with the Q12. So it was a great opportunity to say, okay, I want to do more with strengths. I also want to explore engagement and how I can support the organisation with engagement. And so that's how I started sort of diving a bit more deeply into it. And then I came across the course, the Accelerated Strengths Coaching course, and came here to do it in September. And from that point on, I was then able to bring that into my work and spend a lot more of my time working with engagement and strengths together.
Yeah, fantastic. I'd love to be able to go back and revisit each of those points that you've just made and talk about them in a bit more detail. I know as an organizational psychologist and in your work in different industries, you've used lots of engagement tools and you've been part of engagement processes before. Can you talk a little bit about Q12 and what you see as its benefits and how it differs from different instruments that you've used in the past?
Well, it's really helpful to use as a basis for conversations because it looks at individual needs and how I can be supported as an individual and grow and develop as an individual. And it also looks at the teamwork items around my place in the team and how I belong in the team and how I value and how I'm valued by others in the team. So having both of those makes it actually, that does help in having conversations with managers around how they're developing as leaders, but also how they can support their teams.
Yeah. Can you give me an example of, someone walks in your office or and you need to have a conversation around something. How does it go for you? How do you use the Q12 to have a conversation?
Okay, well, I could step back a few months, and in September, the Q12 was administered across St. Vincent's, and at that time was when I did the Accelerated Strengths Coaching course. So it was good timing for me that I had a greater awareness of strengths, and I came back and looked at how I could support managers to interpret their survey results. And so part of the work I've been doing is meeting with managers individually, as you've just referred to. It's also been attending team meetings or planning sessions where I'm there to talk about engagement, and I certainly introduce strengths as part of that conversation. And so I introduce the principles of engagement and the hierarchy, how to interpret the actual reports that managers receive, and then look at how they can then have conversations with their teams afterwards as they're preparing their action plans. So they're the three main points that I go through when I'm talking about Q12.
Okay, fantastic. There's a lot of the audience actually won't know that much about Q12. Some of the regular listeners will know that Q12 is Gallup's employee engagement metric. But the point that you made is that it's called Q12 because there are 12 items that are the foundational needs of employees that the Gallup has identified. And they're sort of listed in a hierarchy, like a Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And it starts with foundational needs of things like, I know what's expected of me at work, and do I have the equipment and materials I need to get the job done? And then it goes further into the team, and then in the individual, and at the very top, it's really about, how do I develop and am I being developed? So those typically, when we have coaches or consultants who are using Q12 results, they'll look at the red pain points or sort of the glare issues or areas for the organization, and that's where they will start, is with those. Is that how your approach has been? I mean, how have you known where to sort of start with the Q12?
Okay, so I can give you a bit of an overview of how I present this information. So I start with saying, introducing what I'm going to do, and it's around those three main topics. I really emphasize that it's important for people to understand the principles and the framework and the hierarchy, because that information sets them up to have the conversations with their teams and to interpret the reports. So I also acknowledge right up front that it's very aligned with St. Vincent's mission and values. So I talk about this right up front as being a strengths-based approach to development. And we're looking to, as you look at your reports, we're looking to focus on the area of strength and to look at what's led to that being a strength and how have you got to that, and really to leverage and draw on that information as you're working with the areas for improvement. So I do say that right up front. St. Vincent's has a strategy around seeing something greater. So it's about that. That's very aligned with going from good to great, and a value of excellence. Amongst our values, one of them is excellence. So it's very easy for me to introduce that up front and to explain that it's very aligned with our mission and values. I then talk about what engagement means, and I go through the psychological segmentation. So I actually explain that engaged is really that high level of commitment and enthusiasm to the organisation, and it's really raising the bar. It's really about a high level of commitment. It's people who are highly productive and enthusiastic and passionate, and it does acknowledge that psychological element of commitment. The disengaged term refers to people who may be productive. So they may be turning up to work and they may be doing their jobs, but they're thinking about where else they might like to be, and they're not as committed to the organisation. And I acknowledge that is often a large proportion of the workforce. So the disengaged, and that's a smaller proportion, are those people who are unproductive and are actually having a negative impact on others around them. So I think it's important to explain what we're talking about when we're saying engaged employees. So then I go on to talk about why engagement matters, and I give some of those statistics around reduction in turnover and absenteeism, and certainly increased productivity and safety, because the safety stat is, I think, 70% improvements in safety, and in a healthcare environment, that's really important. So then I go on to focus on the hierarchy, and as you acknowledged before, Anne, it's based around a hierarchy of needs, and I do refer to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. For those in it, we're in a clinical, often with a group of people who might have a clinical background, and some of them may be aware of that. So I do make that reference to the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which is around acknowledging the basic needs first, then the needs of the individual, then the team, and then growth and development at the top. And I do point out that that's really important, because what it's saying is if you want to address some of the items that are higher up the hierarchy, you really need to have those at the base sorted. So I also point out that these 12 questions are based on the research and decades of research that Gallup's done, and has identified that these are the key elements that constitute engagement. So if we're looking to raise engagement in our teams, we can impact on any one of these and it will raise engagement. But I do also point out at this stage that the two most important considerations as you're interpreting your survey report are, firstly, to intentionally focus on the strength, because we do typically go to the areas for opportunity, and that is the conventional approach to performance development. So I acknowledge that, and that is often the way that people look at their reports, and many who come to the conversation with me might have already been through that experience of looking at their reports and saying, and these are my two opportunities, and these are the ones I have to prepare action plans for. So that's why I provide this background around the hierarchy and point out that it is a strengths-based approach. So let's focus on the strength and also focus on the first half of the hierarchy. So whilst there may be strengths or opportunities in the top half of the hierarchy, it's really important to actually, I sort of say to managers, it's good to check in from the base, and if there's strengths and if they've come up as not a big area for improvement, it's important to acknowledge that we might want to still check in, because a few months have evolved since September, and I'm still having these conversations now in March. So I say, well, just check in that the basic needs around what's expected of me in my role, and do I have the materials and equipment to do my work, checking in with people around those. In healthcare, question 2 around do I have the materials and equipment to do my work is actually one that comes up a lot as an area of need and improvement, because there's a shortage of resources, and it comes up, and I've heard conversations around so many different issues that it can be referring to all sorts of various forms of materials and equipment. So I do encourage people, even if they don't come up as areas of opportunity, to sort of check in and address those. So that's how I start the conversation. Then what I do as I get to the next items, the next 4, which are around individual contributions and my place as an individual, is I go to question 3, which is at work. I have the opportunity to do what I do best every day at work. And then I ask people, now whether it's a manager or it's their team that I'm with, or it's a large group of managers, because I've presented to all levels of grouping and had conversations at all these levels. It's, what does this mean to you, and what do you think others in your team would be responding when they responded to this question? And so I remind them that the response format was 1 to 5, and a 5 represents, the highest level of engagement. So what do you think people would mean? And it's really interesting to hear the range of responses and such a variety in the sorts of responses. And I acknowledge it, and most people will have something to say that's relevant around what it means to be at my best. And often it's, if I'm a nurse, it's being the best nurse I can be. Or if it's a clinician, it's being the best clinician. And then sometimes some people mention, well, I need to know what it means when I'm doing my best to be able to answer this properly. And then sometimes I hear something around, it's about maximising, reaching my potential, and how can I do that? So then I sort of bring it back to that sort of conversation around, it's about what does it mean when I'm at my best, and that's using my talents and bringing my strengths. And then there's a way to measure that as well. And then I refer to StrengthsFinder. So depending on the conversation, I'll go into more or less detail at this stage when I'm going through the hierarchy. But then at this point, in some cases, I will then explore strengths a bit more and explain what it means. And I'll give my top 5 and I'll talk to that as an example. Or I have had some managers who've done it and who are also willing to share theirs. And so depending on the session, if it's more about engagement, I might just explain that a little bit and then put it to people and say, if you're interested to find out more about that, I can do that. But really, question 3 is one of the most important predictors of engagement. So if you're looking to build engagement in your teams, then this is one that you can address and focus on. And it's important to address it because it's actually the first of the individual needs. And really to be doing addressing the next questions in the hierarchy, you really need to address this one first, because when we look at recognition about strengths is going to be more effective, though it's important that you've got a good understanding about strengths. And I explain that it will give you insights about yourself. It will also help you to understand a strengths-based approach to development. So there's a lot that I can talk about around that comes from starting with question 3.
Yeah. So what's the response that you typically get? I mean, are people familiar with the philosophy of a strengths-based approach? Are they, and how do they typically respond? I mean, when when you talk about it, if they're not familiar with it, do they kind of scratch their head, or are they able to sort of grasp that, and does it resonate with them?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because I really look to see how people are responding as to how much I sort of share about it, and if it's with an individual and I can see that they're interested and they're asking more and they're wanting to know more, then I will share more about that. Or for others, I might leave the conversation there and let them go and have a think about it afterwards. And some people come back to me. And again, that's about their own strengths and how they're responding to it. Interestingly, I've had quite a few people refer to our at one of the sites that I've been working with, because there are a lot of different hospitals within the St Vincent South Australia group. So at one of the sites, the mental health department uses a strengths-based approach to clinical practice. So they're familiar with a strengths-based approach in that clinical setting, which is really interesting. So I'm always keen to hear people who are linking it to practice. I've had some managers, interesting, sometimes it's after a few conversations that some people will say they've heard about it, or they might have done it before, but then I don't know what it means and I didn't actually unpack it. So then that was great. So I could then start that coaching conversation and a coaching sort of relationship with people who might have done it before. At the senior levels of the organisation, some people have done StrengthsFinder, and my understanding is that comes through Q12 being introduced in 2016. So at the senior levels, some of them have also done it. So there are pockets where there's some awareness of StrengthsFinder, or some people have done it but perhaps not really unpacked it. And so, but for a lot of people, there is that sort of aha realization where they start to say, yes, because they might have said, well, these are my 2 areas for improvement. So these are what I need to put in my action plan. And so then I'll have that conversation where I get to that point of talking about strengths and looking at question 3. And so then I'll explain that this is one of the predictors of engagement, and that by addressing this, you can improve engagement. And a way to address this is actually to increase your understanding of your own strengths. And also explain that one strengths intervention in the team can lift engagement for the team. So the conversation can sort of go in different directions, but I certainly do look for the responses that I get, and then I'll provide more or less information depending on how people are responding.
Sure. So with that clinical setting that you were talking about within one of the hospitals, what did the strengths-based practice look like there? How were they using it?
So I'm yet to have further conversations with them. So at this stage, essentially a strengths-based approach in a clinical setting is around not focusing on the disorders, the pathology, or what's wrong. It's about saying, how can we look at what the person brings, their strengths or their resources, and how can we support them with their recovery to bring their own inner resources or strengths. So it's very aligned with a person-centered care approach to providing clinical services, and that's very much part of the whole approach to the work that we do at St Vincent's. It's about providing person-centred care, where it's about looking at the individual's own resources and interests and bringing that into how to support them with their recovery. So
yeah, interesting. Penny, does your conversation around engagement and strengths get into areas of resilience and self-care and well-being of the employees? Is that where you point this often?
Mm-hmm. So I've talked a little bit about how I open up question 3. Question 4 I find is one I spend a lot of time on, and that's around recognition. Mm-hmm. Question 5 is the one that's around someone at work, my supervisor or somebody at work cares about me as a person. And that's the one that I explain is very linked to well-being, because it's about support seeking and receiving support. So, we know that people who are engaged are also report having a high quality of life, and that's around that well-being and support. So that's one that does open up conversations around support. And certainly it's interesting too, some conversations I've had recently around support are in the language that's used as we're working in the next stage of looking at, well, how do I use the findings from the report to put together action plans? And I was with a team of leaders recently who were talking about, how do we talk about improvement and the questions that we can use around putting together our improvement plans that come from the report, from the results. And some of the conversation was around, I simply want to say, how as a leader can I provide more support to you in my teams? Because there's certainly a lot of pressure on people to perform, and the conversation was around, we acknowledge that these people are already working so hard and have so many demands on them that if we come along and say, what can we do? How can we action the survey results for increased, improvements and to improve what we're doing, then we want to be careful not to be adding to their loads, and it's really around support. It's how can I support you? So for some people, for some leaders, that's how they do it. But certainly around resilience and employee wellbeing, I'm also doing some work and training in resilience and wellbeing, and I'm looking to bring in strengths and use that as part of the conversation as well. So essentially, using your strengths and applying your strengths at work is a way to improve engagement, and that then impacts on wellbeing.
Mm. How do you help, or how do you do the action planning? I guess I would say for the next step, once you've sat down with the managers and you've talked about the insights from the reports, do you help them craft action plans for their teams, or do you sort of educate them about, what's possible and then sort of send them on their way to do it themselves? How do you manage that?
So in most cases, I will actually physically sit with them with their report. So if it's a group session for a whole lot of managers where we're not looking at their actual reports, I provide a sample report and I step through each of the elements in the report. So I actually explain how to read it. And again, starting with, you have a strength on your summary page, then you have 2 areas of improvement. And I explain that there's various points of comparison with the report. So there's, you have the results for your own team, those people who report to you directly. Then there's a comparison with the broader team in which you sit, and then with the facility, the organisation as a whole. Then there's also those external comparison points with Gallup's own database of all organisations that have been surveyed. So I explain those various points of comparison, and then I show how to read each part of the report, and always refer people to the glossary, because the glossary is so good at explaining each of these terms. So once people have an understanding of the framework, the hierarchy, the principles, and we've stepped through the report and then they're like, oh, this is great. Now I know what it all means, and they acknowledge that's really helpful. Then I will then explain the recommended process for preparing action plans, and it's based on the engagement champion training that was provided to at St Vincent's. So this was available to people to complete engagement champion training, and that was a day of training. And that role is then, which is partly what I'm doing, is then to support managers and teams to have conversations and prepare their action plans. So the engagement champion role is essentially about how to have conversations about the results and how to look at how they feed into the action plans. So I start with putting it within the context of your teams, and it's important that you bring that context and recognise this was a point in time a few months ago and that there may be changes, and what are your current goals that you have as a team. And again, this is where the language comes into it, as I was saying before. For some people, what are your performance goals as a team? That may resonate, and that may be language that works for them. For others, it's around, what are the important issues that you're currently looking to address, or what are some of priorities that you're working on as a team. So I can put it in different ways and help people to work out, how that's going to fit with the way that they work with their teams. But it's essentially about getting people to think of what are the current priorities that they have for their teams and putting it within that coaching context. So it's not just straight to the 2 areas of opportunity and let's action plan each of those. It's actually, what are the goals that we have and how can this feed into that? And how can this be one source of information that goes into your action planning? And acknowledging they're doing a whole lot of other work. Yes. And there are so many other initiatives across the group, and some that I may not be aware of, I'm sure, and lots of other initiatives and work that are around improvement, and so it's them bringing that to their action planning. So then I step through the tools, because there are various tools, and they're really useful, the tools at the end of the report. There's questions and conversation guides. So it's essentially around what were your responses to the report? And these are questions that managers can ask when they have conversations with their teams. So trying to elicit their responses, reactions to the report and the results, and what do you think this might mean? What surprised you? How might the results look different now? Again, acknowledging how things have changed. And some people are saying, "Oh yes, that was addressed straight away, and that's resolved," and then I might encourage them still to sort of check in and just run it past people just to see where things are at. So it's about having those conversations, giving people a voice, because they may want to add more than they could add at the time, and that's important as well. And looking at, what would a 5 look like? What would this look like if it was improved? And so that important part about having conversations. And yes,
I actually I can't overstate the importance of that, and we see that every day with the clients that we work with. And I love hearing clients say that, the power of just simply having a conversation. And I spoke a couple of weeks ago at a conference, and everyone in the room was either a change manager or they were responsible for internal communication. And people, topics were about the AI economy that's approaching, and all of the, all sorts of different issues. And the most important thing that it came down to, again, was the importance of relationships and trust building and the power of conversations. So whether we were talking about change management space or internal communication space or client care space or patient care space, it's being able and comfortable to have these conversations where you actually connect one human to another. And I'm sure that you have an entire range of responses when you're dealing with managers. I am sure that some of your managers are fully comfortable and feel equipped to have those conversations with their teams. And I imagine others feel very out of their depth. So how do you how do you manage those who feel that they really don't have the innate ability to do have those conversations?
And sometimes that's something that I can, when I'm working one-on-one with a manager, it's something that I acknowledge and I'll say, and it's not always easy to have these conversations. And how would you feel about having this conversation? So sometimes what we do is then we talk about different ways that they might be able to deliver these results with their teams, to their teams, and then I also offer to go along. And that's something else that I've been doing, is then I've been going along to regular team meetings. So in some cases it's a weekly team meeting, or it's, again, because it's been near the start of the year, they've been planning days. So I've been going along and actually saying, here's your report, and handing it out, and let's have the conversation around it. And certainly acknowledging, the manager will be there with their team, and in some cases they're happy for me to be, they'll sit back and happy for me to facilitate the conversation. In some cases, they might be more part of leading it. And so yeah, sometimes it's about actually sort of exploring and brainstorming ways that they could deliver the results, and then talk about them and prepare the action plan. So it might be about meeting with some of their sort of more senior people, so their sort of leadership team within their broader team or department, or sometimes they prefer to just have a larger get-together where they present some of the information and then let people go away, think about it, and then they'll come back and reconvene. And so as part of the tools, there are those conversation guides. There are also sample templates for action planning, which are sort of more standard action planning tools. And so that's part of what I do. There's some of the things I've been doing to help them prepare their action plans.
Yeah. So Penny, the folks that you're working with, are they largely patient facing, or are they not on the front line of dealing with unwell folks?
So I've been working with some more clinical and patient facing teams. I've also worked with IT and there's like an engineering manager and finance and all sorts of teams. So, and also across the organisation at all different levels as well. So some more senior execs as well, which has been great to have that involvement across all levels.
Do you see any unique challenges of those who are facing, or who are client facing or patient facing, that you've had to somehow support them in, or where you see maybe even a greater application for something like a strengths language?
Look, one of the really common themes that's come up has been around question 4, recognition. That's one that I find, interestingly, it may come up as an opportunity for development. I've also had extensive conversations and discussion around it, and then when people look at their report, they'll say, oh, it's actually my strength. And I say, well, that's great. And what we do is the common theme that comes up is around how you can tailor and how you can customize the recognition that you provide to people, and acknowledging that sometimes people have really large teams. So they're saying, well, it's really hard to say I can sort of get to know the strengths of each individual and then tailor the recognition that I'm giving to their preferred styles. But at least we have conversations around the different forms of recognition that can be provided, and that's around those who like the public recognition in a team meeting, on a notice board, in a newsletter, or those who prefer the more individual styles of recognition, which might be a one-on-one or an email where a more senior person's copied in, so they're getting more recognition for that as well. And again, the managers recognise, I shy away from public recognition, so it's hard for me to give it. And what's been really interesting and has come up a few times, and this is even with some of the more senior managers, is people acknowledging that it's hard to give positive feedback. And that's really what question 4 is about. Question 4 is about, in the last 7 days, I have received praise or recognition for doing good work. And it's around positive. It's praise and recognition for good work. And that is really fascinating. I think that people are saying that some are saying, I find that really hard to give positive feedback. So again, it's how can we, how can we equip people, give them the practice and the skills and the strategies to be more comfortable to do that. It's also interesting that I think that question is not around recognition of a successful outcome. It's actually doing the good work. So it's recognising the effort, and that's that sort of growth mindset piece. It's around the effort that you've put in. So there's a lot to talk about there as far as common themes that come up, and that's also one that's really directly related to relationships with patients, because if we can talk about things more readily with our peers, with managers and their team members, then that's going to set people up to have more effective conversations with patients. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And just being able to, any honest, authentic, genuine conversation is going to increase levels of trust, whether that's with a coworker or whether it's with a client or a patient. And there's tends to be some stereotypes out there that those who are dealing with patients are not always the most able to have conversations that are emotional or acknowledging fears, the patient's concerns or fears, and that sort of thing. So I think it's for those who aren't comfortable having those sorts of conversations, it's a great to have it through a strengths-based approach is a great way to do it. But I like your interpretation of that question number 4, and I find it very interesting that I have definitely heard that in the Australian context, where we have tall poppy syndrome, that it can be uncomfortable to receive positive feedback or praise, or to brag yourself about your own achievements. But it's interesting that there's a struggle to give it to others. And I'm wondering where that comes from. But that's, I don't know if you have any insights on that, but that's a very interesting observation. So if we were to shift out of St. Vincent's for a moment and look at the other areas of your life or your experience, can you talk about any application of strengths or interest in strengths that you've seen in your own personal life with your family or your friends, or is it something that you look at and consider outside of work?
Oh, I certainly look at and consider it outside of work, and I seek to continue and have conversations with people outside of work. So because it's very easy for me to talk about it if I'm in a social or other context, and it's what comes naturally to me because I'm interested in people and their stories, and I ask about work. And if I start hearing about people's experiences at work and as a leader or a manager, for example, then it's very easy for me to talk about what I'm doing and to have conversations around how it could support people. So then in those cases, sometimes people will express an interest and say, that they're interested to do StrengthsFinder, and that's led to some interesting conversations as well. So another interesting piece that came up for me recently was that another organisational psychologist I know completed StrengthsFinder, and it was really interesting that her top 5 were in my top 7.
Oh, wow.
And that is the closest I've seen to my own top 5. And I thought, well, sample of 2 organisational psychologists, and we have an overlap of 5, her 5 in my top 7, which I found really interesting.
Were they in the same order or no?
No, so, my second was her first.
Yes,
and,
right.
My first was in her top 5, and then another one of mine. So, so that was really interesting to see that, because that is the closest I've observed to my own top strengths.
So with your top 5, so we have learner, individualization, arranger, maximizer, and belief. Which one really resonates the most for you? Is there one that you feel that you really lead with, and what does that look like in you?
Well, I was reflecting on that with this work that I've been doing, back to the work I've done at St. Vincent's, and I think learner for me really is a source of energy and motivation, and so it's really leading with learner that led me to be doing this work last year, because I looked into more information about StrengthsFinder, more information about Gallup, and asked questions within the organisation about what was currently being done, about what had been done with that engagement champion training and who was doing what since Gallup did Q12 the previous year. So I think it was really my learner that led my exploring and wanting to improve and add to the work that was already being done.
And what else of the other in the top 5 do you really resonates with you?
So I think the individualization and maximizer. Again, it's very easy for me. I could keep talking very readily, and I have these sorts of conversations virtually daily now about when I'm at St Vincent's on those 3 days. Most of those days I'm talking to people about engagement and how I can help them to make sense of what it all means and how it can help them. So that's certainly been, I think, the maximizer being my influencing theme has really helped in that regard.
Absolutely. As we start to wind down the show, Penny, can you tell me, is there a success story or an example of something that you've worked with someone or a team where you've seen some success and some change, some real change based on the work that you've done with engagement and strengths?
Well, sometimes it's actually the conversations. So I was doing initially briefing sessions for managers where I had set times and any manager could come along. So the approach has been very much, it's by invitation. My services were advertised as Penny can support you with this, and it's whoever wants to come and ask me to help them, I can. And so these initial sessions, which were, you can come along and find out more about this. So I did 1-hour sessions. And what's really rewarding is that the people who then follow up and do contact me, and then I've been meeting with people individually and some of them that have done StrengthsFinder, and we're having ongoing conversations. So some of them are meeting with multiple times, and that's really rewarding to see how as individuals they're really getting a lot out of the individual assessment and applying it not only to their work roles as managers, but they're also looking at the applications in other parts of their lives. And then also just, recently one manager who was sharing, she said, I went to one of your sessions and I came back and I looked at my team who are all in fairly, they were non-clinical sort of administrative roles, all fairly, a lot of sort of consistency in their roles. And she said, and I thought about how I could give one of them who, might enjoy coaching a new person, supporting the development of a new team member. And so I thought that was great that from that 1 hour quite general information session, that there are people who, in this particular manager was saying, I came back and I could see how I could use that strengths-based approach within my team to increase the way people are working together. So that's rewarding to see. And then we're also having ongoing conversations around her completing StrengthsFinder and her team completing StrengthsFinder as well. So
yeah, fantastic. So what's on the horizon for you as you look at what you'd like to do next or tie it into? What are your thoughts?
So there are various public hospitals, private hospitals and aged care facilities within St Vincent's. So I'm looking to work with other facilities. So certainly those conversations, and some of them are just beginning to have conversations with me. So as far as St Vincent's, I'm looking to continue the work that I'm doing there with other parts of the organisation. And in my own work as well outside. So I've been, I bring strengths into the supervision that I provide to other psychologists, and that's been really rewarding as well. And in my own coaching as well. So I have some of my own individual coaching clients and looking to support them and their teams as well. So lots of opportunities for me to be working with strengths.
Yeah, fantastic. I think that's about all that I have. Jim, how are we on time?
Good. Just a couple of comments I want to make though. In Penny, you've taught me something today as we're talking through this. And I've never, I've done hundreds of Q12s. I've led teams on Q12 administrations. I've given tons of feedback sessions. I've never made that connection where I tied strengths to question 3 as an entry point into the Q12. I love the way you said that, right? You kind of cover the basic needs at the bottom. We talk about that all the time. I know it's expected of me and I have the right materials and equipment, those kinds of things. But that third question, right? I do what I do best. Do I get a chance to do what I do best every day? And I love how you brought that in and put strengths on top of that, because that really is the lever, right? We often talk about strengths being a lever inside of engagement to really start to move the enterprise, to move the teams, to move the individuals. And I never have seen it or heard it said that way. So hopefully we're teaching it that way. If we're not, we're going to start. But we do have, and I will make a reminder, Anne, we do have a engagement champions course that we provide for individuals. And so if you just go Google Gallup Engagement Champions course, you can see where those are offered all around the world. So Penny, that was a super good session for me. I wanted to know from you, do you see a question, I won't give it away on what we see in the United States, but do you see a question that gets beat up more maybe than others, or gets misunderstood more than others? Want to talk about that? What do you see?
So I sort of didn't go all the way up the hierarchy today, but I do go all the way up the hierarchy, and we talk about the teamwork questions, and obviously with St. Vincent's there's a strong mission and values, so there's that question around mission and values, and quality is really important, so focus on quality. And then we get to question 10, I have a best friend at work. And I see the size in the room most often, and I acknowledge that this is a controversial question. And in some of our some areas across the organisation, there was some communication provided before the 2017 Q12 went out to explain that this is really about someone you can turn to and someone you can confide in and trust when you're looking for support. And so that, I think, may have helped in some ways, and that's what I do. And I acknowledge that this information might be helpful for next time. But and then I say, and Gallup acknowledges it's controversial too, but there is merit in it, and there is value in asking it. And then, people appreciate that. It's just the language. They're saying, well, why won't we change the language of best friend? Because especially in healthcare, it's important to have boundaries, around clinician-patient relationships. So it's certainly, I think, in that context within healthcare, it does come up as well.
Yeah, I think that's probably a universal question around the world that we get, and we've tested that a million different ways, and best friend at work works best in everything that we do. It's a great question. It absolutely draws more feedback than almost any of them. It creates passion and controversy, and Jane, our COO, Jane Miller, often says, chaos creates clarity. And I actually like the fact that you're having those conversations in the organization to say, hey, here's kind of what this means. I sometimes like to leave it out there blank, because I like that controversy conversation that happens inside teams when you start talking about that. So great feedback. I was wondering if you were going to say that. We hear that all the time in question 10. One more comment from me. You kind of mentioned when we think about well-being and when we think about thriving, and that is a word that in strengths continues to come up more and more often, I think, as the community matures around strengths. We always say strengths is really a tool inside this idea of engagement, but well-being is coming up more and more, this idea of thriving. Julie Wexler, who was on Called the Coach last Friday, so before you, she often she approaches in her coaching kind of strengths from these critical or very traumatic events, cancer being one of those for people, right? And she kind of approaches sometimes of people thriving or surviving using strengths through that. And I'll encourage others, if you're listening to this webcast and you haven't heard that one with Julie, go back and listen to it. But I would imagine in the medical field, as we think about, there's trauma involved in some of these, right? In some of these in the medical field. Do you see, or have you had any experience where you're helping people who've been through traumatic events and filtering that through strengths? Or have you done or seen any work like that?
So I haven't myself been involved in that sort of work. So but I understand that it does have applications in those areas. So I'll be interested actually I haven't looked at that Called to Coach, and I will. But there's certainly other research that I've drawn on and that I do refer to about, again, the importance of psychological safety and impacts on clinical outcomes. So,
yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. I'm hearing more and more in the community that we're in. I'm hearing more and more about this thriving, and I think our healthcare systems are right positioned correctly in the right place to be able to affect that
Yeah.
more and more in what they're doing, right? And it's not necessarily, well-being is more than just health. But if you're in pain or if you're suffering,
Mm.
it's hard for the rest of those elements, right? I mean, you probably see this with the patients,
Mm.
is that if the patient's struggling, if they're in pain, it's hard for them to thrive. And there's other things that have to be done medically, but certainly I think there's a space for this where we think about
Yeah.
how we're uniquely designed, right?
And that's certainly, one of my interests is certainly around employee well-being and acknowledging that for employees, and that again, hopefully, is part of what they're doing when they're dealing with their patients. So
Yeah, well, when you see mission and purpose, and if they're struggling in their job, right? If they're not feeling like they're fulfilling that mission and purpose of great, outstanding healthcare. I took my team out to lunch today, and we went to this restaurant. At the end of the order, they gave me an iPad that had a survey on it that I could take right at the end, and it was all these questions about the kind of service I'd gotten during the time that I was there. And as I was thinking about those questions, I was thinking back to the service, and they had hit every single one of those. Was a friendly? Were you acknowledged as soon as you got on here? So as we were walking out of the store, walking out of the restaurant, they big smiles and thanks for coming and all this engagement in that. And I thought they are absolutely, inspecting what they expect in this, and that they're getting that feedback back. And I knew those people working, at the restaurant were thinking about the measurements they would be held to, right? And I think so. It's great to hear from you and hear that that St. Vincent's is working along these lines, and really people are starting to think through those, through those levels, and you're helping them do it. So Penny, thank you for coming tonight. And let's wrap it. Why don't you thank her as well for me?
Yeah, absolutely. Penny, thank you so much. You've given our listeners and our viewers a lot to think about, and you've given us all a glimpse into what your work day is like, dealing with engagement and strengths issues within St. Vincent's, and looking forward to hearing how things go over the next few years, and following your journey. So thanks again.
Thanks for having me. Thanks, Anne. Thanks, Jim.
You bet, Penny. Thanks for coming into the office too, as well, and making all that work. Hang around for just a second. We'll remind everyone to take full advantage of all the resources we have available at the Gallup Strength Center, just GallupStrengthsCenter.com. We spent a lot of time talking about Q12 today, and that's available on another site we have available, Q12.Gallup.com. That has all our information out there that's available for you if you're interested in doing that. Great way you can actually do self-service teams. And so if you want to purchase those for a team, and you can do them as little as a team of 5, those are available on our Q12 site. A bunch of videos, a bunch of resources. It'll help walk you through it as well. We mentioned that course that's available for you. Creating an Engaged Workplace course for engagement champions is available. It's on our courses page if you go to courses.gallup.com. And so you can get more information out there on that. If you have any questions, or you didn't write any of that down, but you're ready now, email coaching@gallup.com. Send us your questions. We'll email you back or call you back with that some of that information, walk you through that as well. Don't forget, we've got a lot of videos just like this one available for you. I mentioned that one with Julie from last week. It's available on our coaches blog. Hopefully by the time you're listening to this, it will be. It's head out to coaching.gallup.com, and all of the resources are available out there for you. If you're interested in becoming a Gallup-Certified Strengths Coach, you can see a list of all our courses that lead to that. We talked about that earlier, courses.gallup.com. I mentioned that. Or there's a contact form right there on the live page. You can fill that in. Don't forget, you can join our Facebook group as well. We have over 10,000 people in our Facebook group that are talking about this stuff all the time. If you want to join in the conversation, head out to facebook.com/groups and then put in called to coach, and that'll take you right to our page. And you can just ask to be entered into the group, and I will let you in. I approve every single one of those, and we'd love to have you in the group as well. We want to thank you for coming out and being a part of our webcast, and we'll do another call to coach here. But with that, we'll say goodnight, everybody.